So, what was a medieval demesne? The simplest way to think about it is this. It was the lord's land. It was the part of the manor that the lord kept for his own use. He did not rent it out to tenants. Instead, the produce from this land went directly to him. It was his personal farm, the source of his food and his wealth. To understand the demesnes, you have to understand the manor. Most of medieval Europe was organized into manors. A manor was a piece of land, an estate. It could be small, just a village and its surrounding fields. Or it could be huge, covering several villages. At the top was the lord. This could be a king, a great baron, a knight, or even a monastery or a bishop. The lord owned the manor. The land of the manor was typically divided into three parts. First, there was the Demesne. This was the lord's part. We'll come back to this. Second, there was the land held by the peasants. These were the villagers who lived and worked on the manor. They had their own plots of land to farm, which they used to feed their families. Third, there was the common land. This included pastures where everyone could graze their animals, and woods where they could gather firewood or let their pigs forage for acorns. The demesne was the heart of this system. Its name comes from an Old French word, demesne, which means something like belonging to a lord. It was often the best land on the manor. It had the most fertile soil and the best access to water. The size of the demesne varied a lot. On some manors, it might be a quarter or a third of all the farmland. On others, it could be half or even more. The crucial difference between the demesne and the peasant's land was who worked it and who got the profits. A peasant farmed his own strips of land to survive. He and his family ate the grain they grew. If they had a little extra, they might sell it at a local market, but the demesne was different. The produce of the demesne, the wheat, the barley, the oats, belonged entirely to the lord. It filled his barns, it fed his family, his knights, his servants, and his guests in the manor house. Any surplus was his to sell. This might sound like the lord was just a landowner with a very big farm. But it was more complicated than that. The relationship between the lord and the peasants was not one of landlord and tenant in the modern sense. It was based on obligation. The peasants who lived on the manor, especially the unfree ones known as serfs or villeins, were tied to the land. They couldn't just pack up and leave. In return for their own little plot of land to live on, they owed the lord's service. And the most important service they owed was labor. So, who did the actual farming on the lord's demesne? The peasants did. They had to plow the lord's fields, sow his seeds, weed his crops, and bring in his harvest. This was not paid work. It was a duty, a form of rent paid not in money, but in sweat and time. The entire system was set up to make the demesne productive for the lord using the forced labor of his tenants. The demesne, then, was more than just a piece of property. It was an engine of the medieval economy. It was the physical representation of the lord's power. His control over the demesnes gave him control over the food supply. And control over food meant control over people. It was the foundation upon which the whole structure of the manor and much of the feudal world was built. Without the demesne and the labor system that supported it, a medieval lord was not really a lord at all. He was just a man who owned some empty fields. The demesne gave him his income, his food, his status, and his power. The lord's demesne did not work itself. It required constant effort, from the hard work of plowing in the spring to the frantic rush of the harvest in the fall. And all this work was done by the peasants. Their labor was the fuel that kept the demesne running. This system of work was highly organized, and it was not optional. The main workforce was made up of the unfree tenants of the manor, the villeins or serfs. And a villein held land from the lord. This gave him the right to farm his own strips in the village fields to support his family. But this right came with heavy strings attached. The primary obligation was labor service on the lord's demesne. This was the rent for his land. This labor was divided into two main types. The first was called week work. This was the regular, year-round commitment. A typical villein might be required to work on the demesne for 2 or 3 days every week. The exact amount varied from manor to manor and depended on the size of the peasant's own land holding. A man with 30 acres owed more work than a man with 5. This week work covered the routine tasks of the agricultural year. One week it might be plowing, another week it might be mending fences or digging ditches. On his assigned days, the villein had to show up with his own tools, and if he had one, his own ox or team of oxen for plowing. His own farm had to wait. The lord's work came first. The second type of labor was called boon work. This was extra work demanded by the lord at the busiest times of the year, especially planting and harvesting. The harvest was the most critical time. All the crops had to be brought in quickly before the weather turned. During this period, a lord could demand that all his tenants, sometimes even the freemen, come to work on his demesne until the job was done. This was a heavy burden because the peasants needed to harvest their own crops at the same time. Boon work was often resented. Sometimes the lord would provide a small reward, like a meal or some ale for the workers at the end of the day to make the work go a little easier. But it was still a command, not a request. This whole system was managed by a hierarchy of officials. The lord himself might not even live on the manor. Many great lords owned dozens of manors and moved between them. In his absence, the estate was run by a steward or a bailiff. The bailiff was the lord's man on the ground. He was responsible for the Demesne farm. He decided what to plant, managed the livestock, and organized the selling of any surplus. Working under the bailiff was a man called the reeve. The reeve was a peasant himself, usually one of the more respected or substantial villagers. He was often elected by the villagers, but the lord had the final say. The reeve's job was a difficult one. He was the foreman. He had to get up before dawn and make sure the other peasants showed up for their work on the Demesne. He assigned them their tasks for the day and had to ensure the work was done properly. He was caught in the middle. The bailiff pressured him to get more work out of the peasants, while his fellow villagers often disliked him for being the one who enforced the lord's will. The rhythm of the work followed the seasons. In the autumn, after the harvest was in, the fields would be plowed for the winter wheat. Winter was a quieter time, with tasks like threshing the harvested grain with flails on the barn floor, repairing tools, and tending to the animals. Then came spring, the busiest time besides the harvest. The fields for spring crops like barley and oats had to be plowed and sown. As summer began, the hard work of weeding the Lord's crops started. Then came haymaking in the meadows, a crucial task to provide winter feed for the animals. Finally, in late summer, the grain harvest began, the most intense period of the year. Every able-bodied person was needed in the fields, cutting the grain with sickles or scythes, binding it into sheaves, and carting it back to the Lord's great barn. The failure to perform these labor duties had serious consequences. The manor had its own court, presided over by the lord or his steward. A peasant who failed to show up for work, or who did a poor job, could be fined. These fines, paid in cash or in kind, were another source of income for the lord. The system was rigid and based on compulsion. It was a life of hard, repetitive labor, dictated not by one's own needs, but by the needs of the lord's demesne. When you picture a medieval demesne, you might just think of open fields. But it was much more than that. The demesne was a complex landscape of buildings, gardens, and natural resources, all controlled by the lord for his own benefit. It was the physical center of the manor. At the heart of the demesne stood the manor house. This was not always a grand stone castle. On a smaller manor, it might be a large timber-framed hall, not much bigger than the houses of the wealthiest peasants, but set apart from the village. This was the administrative center of the manor. It was where the manor court was held and where the lord stayed when he visited. If the lord lived elsewhere, the house was occupied by his bailiff. The hall was the main room, where meals were eaten and business was done. Around the house would be other buildings, a kitchen, a bakehouse, and a brewhouse, all working to feed the lord's household. Clustered near the manor house were the home farm buildings, the guts of the Demesne operation. The most important of these was the Great Barn. This was often the largest building on the manor. It was built to store the immense quantities of grain harvested from the Demesne fields. Inside, the grain was threshed during the winter months. There were also stables for the lord's horses, which were used for riding and for transport, and byres for his oxen, the main draft animals used for plowing. There might be cowsheds, pigsties, and shelters for sheep. These buildings protected the lord's valuable livestock and stored the food that would see his household through the year. Beyond the farm buildings, the demesnes contained special resources that the lord often kept as a monopoly. A very common feature was a watermill, or, in flatter areas, a windmill. The peasants were usually forbidden from grinding their own grain at home with hand querns. They were required to bring their grain to the lord's mill and pay a fee for the service. This fee, called multure, was a significant source of cash income for the lord. The miller who ran the mill for the lord was often a distrusted figure in the village, suspected of taking more than his fair share. Similarly, the lord might own the only large oven in the village. Peasants would have to bring their dough to the lord's bakehouse and pay to have it baked into bread. The Demesne also included valuable sources of food. A fish pond was a common feature. The fish were an important part of the medieval diet, especially since the church forbade eating meat on Fridays and during Lent. A well-stocked pond provided a ready supply of fresh fish, like carp and pike, for the lord's table. Another status symbol was the dovecote or pigeon house. Only lords were typically allowed to keep pigeons. These birds provided a constant supply of tender meat squabs and eggs. Their droppings were also a highly prized fertilizer for the Demesne gardens. There would almost certainly be an orchard growing apples, pears, and cherries. Apples were especially important for making cider, the everyday drink in many parts of Europe. A vegetable garden, or herb garden, near the manor house would provide produce for the kitchen. The demesnes often included a large patch of meadowland, usually along a river. Hay from the meadow was essential winter fodder for the animals, and the lord always kept the best meadows for himself. Finally, the demesne included rights over the wider landscape. The lord controlled the woodland. Peasants might be allowed to gather fallen branches for firewood, but cutting down timber was forbidden without the lord's permission. The woods were also where the lord hunted. Hunting deer and wild boar was a noble sport, a sign of high status, and strictly reserved for the lord and his guests. Poaching was a serious crime with severe punishments. All these elements, the house, the barns, the mill, the pond, the woods, made up the Demesne. It was a self-contained unit designed to support the lord's lifestyle. It gave him not just grain from the fields, but also flour from the mill, fish from the pond, meat from the dovecote, and wood from the forest. It was a landscape of power, where every feature was a reminder of the lord's control over the land and the people who worked it. The Demesne existed for one reason: to benefit the lord. Its purpose was both economic and social. It was the engine that powered the lord's household, funded his lifestyle, and cemented his position at the top of the social hierarchy. It was the foundation of his power. The first and most basic purpose of the demesne was to provide food. This is called subsistence. The demesne had to produce enough grain, meat, and drink to feed the lord and his entire household, which could be a very large group of people. This household, known as the familia, included the lord's immediate family, but also resident knights, clerks, administrators, personal servants, stable hands, kitchen staff, and a constant stream of visitors. Feeding such a large number of people year-round was a massive undertaking. The wheat from the demesne's fields was ground into flour for their bread. The barley was malted and brewed into ale, the staple drink for everyone. Oats fed the horses. The livestock raised on the demesnes provided meat, milk, and cheese. Everything was geared towards consumption by the household. In the early Middle Ages, this was often the demesne's main function. Manors were largely self-sufficient units. The lord and his household would consume most of what the demesnes produced. There was not much of a wider market for selling surplus food. A great lord who owned many manors would often travel from one to the next with his entire household in tow. They would stay at a manor for a few weeks or months, literally eating their way through the food that had been stored up in the barns and larders from the Demesne. When the supplies ran low, they would pack up and move on to the next manor. This practice was known as itineration. But as time went on, especially from the 12th century onwards, the purpose of the demesnes began to shift. Towns and cities were growing, and with them, markets for agricultural goods. Lords realized they could make money by producing more than their households could consume. The demesne became less of a personal pantry and more of a commercial enterprise. The goal was now to generate a surplus that could be sold for cash. This shift led to a more business-like approach to farming, sometimes called high farming. The lords and their managers, the bailiffs and stewards, started to think about maximizing profits. They began to keep detailed written accounts. These manorial accounts, many of which survive today, give us an incredible window into the medieval economy. They record every detail: how much seed was sown, how much grain was harvested, how many animals were born and died, what was consumed by the household, and, most importantly, what was sold at market and for how much. They were trying to run the Demesne as efficiently as possible. They invested in new equipment, experimented with crop rotations, and used marl or manure to improve the soil. The cash generated from selling the demesne's surplus was vital. A lord needed money for many things that his land could not produce directly. He needed it to buy luxury goods like silk, spices, and fine wine. He needed it to purchase armor and weapons for himself and his knights. He had to pay taxes to the king. If he wanted to build a new church or a stronger castle, he needed cash to pay for the stone and the skilled masons. The demesnes, therefore, became a crucial link between the rural manor and the wider cash economy. Finally, the demesne served a social purpose. It was a clear and constant display of the lord's status. The very existence of a large tract of land worked for him by others reinforced the social order. His great barn, bigger than any peasant's cottage, was a symbol of his wealth. His exclusive right to hunt in the woods or keep pigeons in a dovecote set him apart from the common folk. The Demesne was not just a farm, it was a statement. It declared who was in charge. By controlling the most productive land and the labor of the people, the lord demonstrated his dominance. The Demesne was the economic bedrock that supported the entire social and political structure of feudalism. The Demesne system, which had dominated the European landscape for centuries, did not last forever. Starting in the 14th century, a series of crises and slow changes began to wear it down. The old way of running a manor with a central Demesne farm worked by the forced labor of tenants gradually fell apart. The single biggest blow was the Black Death, the plague which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351 was a human catastrophe. It killed a third to a half of the entire population. This had a devastating economic impact. Suddenly, there were not enough people to do the work. Land was plentiful, but labor was incredibly scarce. This completely changed the balance of power between lords and peasants. Before the plague, a lord had a ready supply of villains to work his demesne. After the plague, he found it difficult to find enough workers. Peasants who survived were in a much stronger bargaining position. They could demand higher wages for their work. If one lord refused, they could threaten to leave and go to another manor where the lord was desperate for laborers and willing to pay more. The old laws tying serfs to the land became almost impossible to enforce. For the lords, the old system stopped making sense. Why struggle to force reluctant tenants to work on your demesne when you had to pay them high wages anyway? It was expensive and inefficient. Many lords decided it was easier to get out of the farming business altogether. Instead of farming the demesne themselves, they began to lease it out. This led to a process called commutation. The labor service was commuted, or changed, into a cash rent. A peasant no longer had to work 3 days a week on the lord's land. Instead, he paid the lord a fixed sum of money each year. The peasant was then free to spend all his time working his own land, making it as productive as he could. This was a profound shift. The relationship between lord and peasant was becoming less about personal obligation and more about a simple financial contract. So what happened to the demesne land itself? It was often broken up and rented out in smaller parcels to individual peasants. Ambitious and successful peasants, sometimes called yeomen, might lease large chunks of the former demesne. They farmed it for their own profit, paying a cash rent to the lord. The lord became a landlord in the modern sense, an owner who collected rent rather than a direct farm manager. His income now came from cash payments, not from a barn full of grain. This process did not happen everywhere at the same time or in the same way. Some conservative lords tried to cling to the old ways, enforcing labor services and trying to keep wages down. This often led to conflict and rebellion, like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But the economic pressures were too strong. Over the next century or two, direct cultivation of the demesnes by forced labor largely disappeared from Western Europe. In the later Middle Ages, another development called enclosure also changed the landscape. Instead of leasing out the demesne, some lords decided to consolidate it. They would fence it off from the rest of the manor's open fields. This was often done to convert the land from growing crops to raising sheep. The wool trade was becoming very profitable, and sheep farming required fewer workers than growing grain. This process of enclosure created the patchwork of fields, with hedges that we see in much of the English countryside today, but it also pushed many peasant families off the land. By the end of the medieval period, the classic demesne was a thing of the past. The word demesne survived, but its meaning changed. It came to refer to the parkland or home farm that was attached to a country manor house, land that the owner kept for his private use. But the system that had defined it, a great farm at the heart of the manor, worked by the unfree labor of tenancy, had faded into history. It was replaced by a world of landlords, tenants, and wage laborers, a world that was beginning to look much more like our own.